The airfield lay in a silence so complete it felt staged, as if the war had stepped back to watch what happened next. When the Marines advanced across the broken tarmac, they expected wreckage, not revelation. Yet there, resting under the Pacific sun, stood a Mitsubishi G4M, nearly whole, its pale green skin shimmering like a relic abandoned in haste. For a moment, no one spoke. Even in captivity, the bomber carried the aura of something both dangerous and vulnerable. American pilots circled it slowly, studying the long, fragile wings that had once carried it across thousands of miles of open sea. From a distance, the span had always looked predatory. Up close, it seemed impossibly delicate. They traced the tapering surfaces with gloved hands, sensing a design philosophy driven by ambition rather than protection. The G4M was built to outrun limits, not bullets. When the sunlight shifted, small circles of distortion appeared across the fuselage, patched bullet holes, sealed with thin metal plates hammered into place. Each repair told a quiet story, a crew pressed to fly again, a machine expected to return to the sky no matter how deeply it had been wounded. A marine mechanic tapped the skin with the back of a wrench and listened as the hollow ring confirmed what rumors had long suggested. Armor, if it could be called that, was almost non-existent. Through open inspection panels, they examined the fuel tanks, smooth, unlined, untouched by the protective layers common in American aircraft. It was here that the bomber's secret was laid bare. One spark, one tracer round, and this elegant machine became a torch. Veterans among the group exchanged memories of fiery arcs across night skies, of Betas that vanished in bursts of orange light before crews could even bail out. In the stillness of that captured airfield, a quiet realization settled over the Americans. The enemy's most feared long-range bomber had achieved its reach through sacrifice, an aircraft engineered to travel far, knowing it might never return. But none of them yet understood why Japan accepted such risk, or how this fragile machine had once shifted the balance across the Pacific. A revelation awaited in the next hangar. When the Mitsubishi G4M entered service in 1941, it embodied a vision that seemed almost prophetic. Japan needed a bomber that could cross vast distances of ocean, strike without warning, and return before the enemy could react. The solution was elegant, radical, and quietly perilous. Engineers at Mitsubishi pursued a single idea with unwavering conviction. Range was everything. Every component, every contour, every compromise bowed to that demand. Fuel capacity rose until the wings were little more than flying tanks. To compensate, armor vanished piece by piece. Protective plating around the cockpit was removed, then the reinforcement around the fuel lines, then the shielding for the gunners. Even self-sealing tanks, standard in most air forces, were judged too heavy for an aircraft designed to outrun its shadow. The G4M's creators believed that speed, altitude, and surprise would serve as its armor. They trusted that the bomber's reach would keep it beyond the grasp of enemy fighters. In the opening months of the Pacific War, it seemed they were right. Betty units ranged across Southeast Asia with startling effectiveness. They struck Malaya and Java with a precision that stunned Allied commanders. Then came their most dramatic triumph, the sinking of HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse off the coast of Malaya. For the first time in naval history, capital ships had been destroyed solely by land-based aircraft. To Japanese strategists, it felt like vindication. Doctrine and design appeared perfectly aligned. Inside Mitsubishi, no one questioned the gamble at the heart of the aircraft's philosophy. Success concealed risk. Victories, quick and dazzling, postponed the uncomfortable truth that a bomber built for reach alone could not withstand a long war of attrition. Each celebrated mission quietly eroded the margin for error. Now, standing before the captured aircraft on that silent airfield, American crews could see what early triumphs had hidden. The smooth, unlined fuel tanks, the fragile skin, the absence of armor. Each feature revealed a dangerous trade-off, one that had shaped Japan's early momentum and would later determine its collapse. What the Americans would discover next, however, reached beyond engineering. It pointed to a deeper flaw, one woven into Japan's entire strategy for the Pacific War. American intelligence officers arrived with cameras and notebooks, treating the captured aircraft not as a trophy, but as a question that needed answering. They moved with quiet purpose, photographing every seam and rivet, documenting each feature that had once been obscured by distance, speed, and the chaos of combat. Under the open Pacific sky, the Betty's vulnerabilities could no longer hide behind reputation. As the inspection deepened, pilots traced the fuel lines running through the wings, thin, exposed, and astonishingly unprotected. They followed the silver tubes as one might follow arteries beneath translucent skin, realizing how a single incendiary round could turn them into channels of flame. 4 main tanks sat side by side, each one large enough to carry the bomber across oceans, and each one unshielded. The Americans paused, imagining the moment of ignition. A spark, a flash, then the entire wing blooming into fire. Mechanics, working methodically, calculated the consequences. They knew the volatility of aviation fuel, the physics of heat spreading through aluminum, the grim mathematics of structural failure. Their assessments aligned with battlefield memories, betas that had erupted midair with no apparent warning, aircraft that vanished into falling streaks of light before anyone could understand why. Now, with the evidence laid bare before them, the mystery dissolved into clarity. Inside the cockpit, another revelation awaited. The armor behind the pilot's seat was little more than a token gesture, thin plating added for form, not survival. There was no protective cradle for the crew, no reinforced bulkhead, nothing to absorb the force of incoming rounds. When the Americans compared these findings with their own bombers, machines built with self-sealing tanks, layered armor, and redundant safety systems, the contrast felt almost unsettling. What had once seemed a formidable, almost mythical opponent now appeared tragically delicate. Its danger had come not from strength, but from reach, not from protection, but from the willingness to forego it. The shock the Americans felt was not triumph but recognition, a philosophical jolt that revealed the deeper cost of Japan's strategic choices. Yet this discovery raised a larger question, one that extended far beyond the skin of a single aircraft. If Japan had gambled so much on range, what other assumptions beneath its war doctrine were waiting to break? Long before the first Betty rolled from its assembly line, Japanese naval planners faced a geography that felt more like an adversary than a map. The Pacific was an ocean of distances, thousands of kilometers of open water separating outposts, shipping lanes, and potential battlefields. To project power across such immensity, Japan needed aircraft that could cross horizons others considered impassable. Endurance was not simply a requirement, it became a doctrine, shaped by necessity and reinforced by ambition. Within the Naval Air Service, this idea hardened into conviction. If Japan could outrange every opponent, it could strike where it wished and vanish into the vastness before retaliation arrived. Range was no longer just a measure of fuel capacity. It was a strategy, a shield, and eventually a kind of faith. Engineers were encouraged, quietly but insistently, to pursue designs that defied convention. Weight was the enemy, distance the prize. Every kilogram saved meant more fuel, more reach, more strategic leverage. In this environment, the Mitsubishi design teams worked with an almost monastic focus. Early test flights revealed something extraordinary. The prototype bomber could travel more than 3,000 kilometers, far beyond the performance of contemporary Western aircraft. To the planners who watched from the ground, the achievement felt like confirmation that their doctrine was not only logical, but inevitable. Japan, an island empire reliant on mobility, had created a machine that could roam the Pacific without constraint. The celebration was immediate and uncritical. Reports praised the aircraft's endurance, its operational flexibility, its ability to strike remote targets without carrier support. Missing from the discussion were the compromises buried beneath those numbers. No one dwelled on the absence of armor around the cockpit, the thin plating along the fuselage, or the fuel tanks that lacked any self-sealing material. These details were treated as acceptable sacrifices, minor adjustments in the pursuit of a greater vision. Gradually, the assumption took hold. Protection was unnecessary when the enemy could not reach you. The bomber's speed and range would keep it safe. Its long wings would carry it beyond danger. In meeting rooms and briefing halls, officers repeated the idea until it felt like fact. The Pacific was their ally, a moat surrounding a fortress they believed no adversary could cross. For a time, this belief seemed justified. Early wartime victories further entrenched the notion that Japan's doctrine had been not only bold but prescient. Yet the logic carried an unspoken flaw, one that no celebration could obscure. Range could delay confrontation, not eliminate it. Sooner or later, the enemy would adapt. And when they did, the Betty's carefully hidden vulnerabilities would stand exposed. What no one in the Imperial Navy yet understood was that the very distances they trusted would soon bring a new kind of opponent into the skies, one the Betty had never been designed to survive. At the beginning of the Pacific War, American air crews entered the conflict with machines engineered for a different kind of geography. Their bombers carried armor, self-sealing tanks, and heavy defensive gun positions, features shaped by European combat, not the immense distances of Asia and the Pacific. None of them imagined that Japan had already moved in another direction entirely, designing aircraft whose endurance seemed almost unnatural. To American planners, the idea of stripping protection for the sake of range felt reckless, even irresponsible. This assumption shaped early judgments. Reports describing Japan's new land-based bombers were read with skepticism, their claimed performance dismissed as exaggeration or propaganda. If the aircraft were truly so lightly built, American analysts reasoned, then they could not possibly survive sustained combat. The U.S. misread philosophy as error, seeing fragility where Japan saw purpose. And in those first months, the consequences of that misunderstanding would become painfully clear. When Betty bombers first appeared over Malaya and the Philippines, American and Commonwealth pilots were surprised not by their vulnerability, but by their speed. The G-4M moved with a grace that contradicted its size, closing the distance with a smoothness that left little time for interception. In the South China Sea, its torpedo runs struck with a precision that stunned Allied observers. The sinking of Prince of Wales and Repulse reverberated across American naval circles, not just as a tactical disaster, but as evidence that this fragile bomber possessed an ability no one had anticipated. It could deliver decisive blows before defenders could organize a response. These early shocks forced a reevaluation. U.S. officers began studying how a machine that lacked armor could execute such devastating attacks. They noted the long, slender wings that allowed efficient cruising, the high internal fuel load that granted it reach, the disciplined coordination of Japanese naval aircrews trained to operate far from carriers or land bases. What emerged was a clearer understanding. The Betty was not an accident of design, but the product of a deeply rooted doctrine built on experience the United States had not yet gathered. American engineers responded according to their own philosophy. Rather than stripping protection to match the Betty's range, they doubled down on survivability, reinforcing bulkheads, improving gun turrets, and refining self-sealing technology. Where Japan sought perfection in reach, the United States pursued balance, durability, firepower, and adaptability. Two cultures, shaped by different histories and geographies, forged two divergent paths through the same war. But as the months passed, it became clear that these paths would soon collide in the skies over the Pacific. One doctrine believed safety came from distance, the other believed safety came from strength. Only combat would reveal which assumption would endure. And far to the east, new American aircraft were rolling off assembly lines, machines that would test the limits of Japan's range-first philosophy in ways no planner had foreseen. As the Pacific War stretched into its brutal middle years, the skies that had once sheltered the Betty grew narrow and unforgiving. The bomber that had roamed freely across Southeast Asia now found itself confronted by a new reality, one shaped by hardened American defenses, faster interceptors, and a battlefield where distance no longer guaranteed safety. What had been an advantage in 1940, one became a liability in 1943. The very lightness that gave the G-4M its reach now became the measure of its vulnerability. In New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, U.S. fighters began to meet the Betty at closer ranges, often catching formations before they could climb to their preferred cruising altitudes. Pilots described scenes that repeated with unsettling consistency. A short burst from a P-38 or F-4F, followed by an eruption of orange flame along the bomber's wing. The fuel tanks, unprotected and densely packed, ignited with a violence that left no time for correction. Crews had mere seconds, too few to extinguish fire, too few even to jump. Survivors spoke of fires that spread like liquid light, racing through the fuselage with a speed that no training could counter. Escape hatches became irrelevant, parachutes useless. In many cases, the Betty simply disintegrated in midair, consumed by the very fuel that allowed it to travel so far. Each loss carried the same grim lesson. The aircraft's endurance came at the expense of its crew's lives. Inside Mitsubishi, engineers proposed incremental modifications. Thin armor plates around the cockpit, reinforced wing sections, even limited self-sealing material for the tanks. These suggestions were met with skepticism at naval headquarters. Every kilogram added threatened the doctrine that underpinned the bomber's existence. Range was still seen as the decisive factor in Japan's war strategy, and anything that diminished it, even marginally, risked weakening the empire's long-distance striking power. And so, the proposals were set aside, casualties rising in their place. Veteran pilots were among the first to voice concern. They described the Betty with a mixture of respect and resignation, calling it a coffin with wings when flown against modern fighters. Their warnings echoed through briefings and after-action reports, but gained little traction. Japan's leadership remained anchored to the idea that the bomber's reach would continue to outweigh its fragility, even as the evidence accumulated in burning wreckage across the Pacific. By the time American forces examined the captured Betty on the silent airfield, the truth was already undeniable. The missing armor, the exposed fuel lines, the thin metallic skin, all confirmed what frontline crews had learned through experience. The bomber's greatest strength had become its fatal flaw. And yet this discovery pointed to a deeper unraveling. Because if the Betty could no longer survive the changing air war, what other pillars of Japan's strategy were beginning to fail? By early 1943, the air war over the Pacific no longer resembled the conflict Japan had prepared for. The tempo had changed, the machines had changed, and the Americans fighting above the jungles of New Guinea and the coral waters of the Solomons now flew aircraft built for a different era of combat. Speed and firepower, once secondary to endurance, became the deciding factors. And while the Betty remained what it had always been, a precise expression of pre-war doctrine, the world around it accelerated beyond the assumptions that created it. New Allied fighters carved their presence into the sky with unmistakable force. The P-38 Lightning, with its twin engines and high-altitude performance, intercepted Betty formations long before they reached their release points. The F-4U Corsair, with its powerful engine and heavy armament, closed the distance so quickly that bomber gunners had only seconds to respond. Even the improved Wildcats, slower than their newer counterparts but sturdier and better armed, proved lethal against a bomber whose skin had been engineered to save weight rather than deflect fire. Together, these aircraft cut through Betty units with increasing efficiency. Where early war missions had been defined by long, unchallenged approaches, 1943 brought sudden engagements, radar-guided interceptions, and coordinated American fighter sweeps. Japan's doctrine of surprise, its confidence that distance alone could shield a bomber, collapsed under the new reality. Allied radar outposts, scattered across islands once considered insignificant, now detected incoming formations long before they appeared on the horizon. The Betty was no longer the unseen hunter, it had become the tracked target. The consequences were immediate and devastating. American .50 caliber rounds tore into the bomber's wings, igniting the fuel tanks with predictable precision. Veteran pilots knew the pattern by heart. One burst, one blossom of flame, one bomber falling from formation in a trail of smoke. The crews inside had little chance to react. The fires spread too quickly, the exits were too few, and the sky offered no refuge for an aircraft designed without margin for damage. Faced with mounting losses, Japanese squadrons began to improvise. Ground crews bolted thin armor plates behind pilot seats, hoping to buy a few more seconds during attacks. Some units filled sandbags and placed them along the fuselage floor, a desperate attempt to blunt incoming fire. Others experimented with reinforcing fuel lines using whatever materials were available on forward airfields. These modifications added weight, negating the doctrine that had shaped the bomber's identity. But none addressed the fundamental problem hidden within the aircraft's structure. The Betty's wings, elegant and efficient, concealed its greatest vulnerability. Inside them lay the unprotected fuel tanks, arranged in a configuration that offered no redundancy and no protective layering. Even small-caliber rounds could rupture a tank, and once ignited, the flames spread through the wing like wind through dry grass. No amount of bolted armor or sandbagged compartments could change the physics of that design. Japan had built a bomber that excelled only under conditions that no longer existed. As Allied fighters evolved in speed, armament, and detection capability, the Betty remained rooted in 1941, a machine optimized for a world that had already vanished. What had once been celebrated as an elegant instrument of long-range warfare now appeared painfully outdated. Its strengths no longer aligned with the battlefield's demands, and its weaknesses had become too severe to ignore, let alone overcome. By mid-1943, even veteran crews understood the Truth, each mission felt less like a strike and more like a test of survival, one in which the bombers' design philosophy worked quietly, inexorably against them. And yet in Tokyo, planners still clung to the belief that range would reclaim its importance, unaware that an entirely new threat was about to reshape the Pacific skies once more. By 1943, the design rooms at Mitsubishi no longer felt like the birthplace of innovation. They felt like triage wards, places where engineers tried to keep an aging aircraft alive in a war that demanded something entirely different. The Betty, once the pride of Japan's long-range aviation, now returned from missions scorched, perforated, or not at all. Its weaknesses, once theoretical, had become daily realities. And so the designers did what they could. They drafted new variants, modest revisions labeled G4M2 and G4M2A, as if new numbers could mask the growing imbalance between ambition and capability. These updated models carried slight improvements. Engines were refined, defensive armament adjusted, and a few areas received incremental reinforcement. Yet the engineers knew the truth better than anyone. None of these changes addressed the aircraft's central vulnerability, the lack of self-sealing fuel tanks. Without them, the Betty remained a bomber defined by fire. But when the engineering teams pleaded for proper tank protection, they encountered a barrier more immovable than doctrine. Japan simply did not have the rubber. The island nation's dwindling access to natural rubber had already strained its military production. To produce self-sealing tanks for thousands of Bettys would have required an industrial capacity Japan no longer possessed. Even if the Navy had approved the redesign, factories could not have supplied the materials. The technical solution existed. The national infrastructure did not. In this way, the Betty became a quiet reflection of Japan's broader wartime economy, stretched thin, strategically ambitious, yet structurally fragile. Inside Navy headquarters, the demands grew increasingly disconnected from frontline reality. Officers insisted that any modifications must preserve the bomber's offensive capability, even as the pool of experienced pilots shrank with every month of fighting. New trainees arrived with fewer flight hours and limited combat exposure, yet they were expected to operate an aircraft that allowed no margin for error. Range and payload remained sacred. Survivability remained secondary. The Navy asked the Betty to keep performing the role it had fulfilled in 1941, even though 1941 was long gone. The modifications that were implemented added weight, an irony not lost on the engineers who had spent years shaving off grams in pursuit of extreme range. But these additions, small armor plates, improved turrets, slightly thicker surfaces, did not meaningfully increase survivability. The bomber remained vulnerable in the places that mattered most, the wings and the tanks that filled them. Every attempt to protect the Betty from its own design philosophy felt like placing bandages over a fault line. Field commanders, struggling to maintain morale, sent reports that grew more somber with each operation. They described crews walking toward their aircraft with a quiet resignation, aware that once airborne, the odds weighed heavily against them. Some units developed rituals before takeoff. Others kept personal belongings ready for immediate return to families if their owners did not survive the mission. The Betty's reputation, once linked to reach and precision, now carried a darker meaning. To fly it was to accept a statistical fate. The psychological toll became impossible to hide. Experienced pilots confided their dread to superiors who could offer no solutions. Younger aviators learned quickly why veterans spoke of the bomber with such reverence and fear. The aircraft demanded discipline, calm, and optimism, yet offered little protection when things went wrong. It was, in every practical sense, a machine from another stage of the war, forced to endure conditions it had never been designed to meet. As Japan's industrial capacity shrank under blockade, resource shortages, and bombing, the Betty became a symbol of a nation attempting to reconcile its strategic ambition with its material limitations. It represented the gap between what Japan wished to project across the Pacific and what it could truly sustain. And although Japan would continue seeking ways to adapt the bomber, each new variant revealed the same truth. No amount of incremental change could undo the choices made at the aircraft's conception. Ahead lay a moment when desperation would push the Betty into roles more dangerous than anything imagined in its design rooms. A transformation driven not by innovation, but by necessity. When American technicians finally restored the captured Betty to flying condition, the moment carried a quiet sense of inevitability. For months they had only observed the bomber from the outside, its thin metal skin, its unprotected fuel lines, its elegant but vulnerable wings. Now at last they would feel the aircraft in motion, learn its strengths and weaknesses from the pilot's seat, and confirm the theories that battlefield experience had already suggested. Test pilots approached the assignment not with excitement, but with the solemnity reserved for machines built with a philosophy entirely unlike their own. The first takeoff surprised them. The Betty lifted with a smoothness that belied its reputation, its long wings generating lift with remarkable efficiency. The engines, carefully tuned by American mechanics, pulled the aircraft forward with steady confidence. In level flight, the bomber moved with an ease that explained its early wartime successes. It covered distance without effort, gliding through the air in a manner more reminiscent of a long-range transport than a combat aircraft. Range, they realized, had not been an abstract design goal for the Japanese. It had been the very essence of the machine. Yet with every passing minute, the sense of fragility deepened. The test pilots felt subtle vibrations along the fuselage, the kind that hinted at minimal reinforcement beneath the skin. The metal panels, so thin they could be flexed by hand on the ground, now transmitted every gust and pressure change. Exposed lines and control cables, visible during pre-flight inspection, left an unmistakable impression. The aircraft had been built on the assumption that it would avoid damage, not endure it. When the pilots executed steep turns and combat maneuvers, the Betty revealed more of its compromises. Banking strained the wings in ways that felt disproportionate to the aircraft's size. Rapid altitude changes produced shutters along the fuel tanks buried within the wing roots. Nothing seemed dangerously defective, yet everything felt precarious, as if the bomber existed within a narrow margin where performance and vulnerability were inseparable. Simulated battle runs confirmed those fears. Ground crews mounted American .50 caliber guns at controlled angles and fired short bursts at reinforced testing panels matching the Betty's construction. The results were decisive. Even minimal fire penetrated deeply, rupturing surfaces that heavier bombers could absorb. When bullets struck areas equivalent to the fuel lines or tanks, test officers watched as the metal tore open in patterns disturbingly similar to wreckage recovered from the field. The Betty's weaknesses were not theoretical. They were predictable, consistent, and fatal. American engineers then dismantled the aircraft piece by piece. They measured the thickness of the skin, examined the fuel compartments, and documented the internal framework. Their reports described an aircraft optimized to a single purpose: travel far, carry much, and trust that speed and distance would suffice as protection. In another era, perhaps on another front, this philosophy might have endured. But in the skies of 1943 and beyond, where radar-directed fighters struck with speed and precision, it had become hopelessly outdated. Intelligence officers drafted their assessment with unusual clarity. Japan, they concluded, would likely continue using the Betty despite its flaws, because no replacement existed at scale, and because doctrinal momentum still carried weight within the Imperial Navy. The bomber was too important to abandon and too vulnerable to survive unaltered. It was trapped, much like the nation that had produced it, between strategic need and diminishing capacity. By the end of the evaluation, the Americans understood the Betty completely: its grace, its logic, its fatal compromises. More importantly, they now knew how to defeat it, not through overwhelming firepower, but through precise exploitation of the structural weaknesses etched into the aircraft from the day it was designed. The mystery was gone. What remained was inevitability. And yet, even as the U.S. documented every flaw, a new question emerged, one that had nothing to do with engineering and everything to do with the changing nature of Japan's war effort. Because soon, the Betty would be asked to serve roles far removed from its original purpose, roles born not of design, but of desperation. By 1943, the great arcs of sky that once sheltered Japan's long-range bombers had transformed into contested corridors. In the Solomons and the waters of the Bismarck Sea, American and Australian air power concentrated with a precision Japan had not anticipated. The Betty, designed for a war of long distances and light opposition, now found itself flying into carefully constructed traps. What had once been an asset of reach became a liability of predictability. Radar stations, scattered across islands whose names barely appeared on pre-war maps, now formed an invisible lattice of detection. As Betty formations lifted from Rabaul or Kavieng, operators tracked their movements almost. Sent from the moment their wheels left the ground. Information flowed through a growing network of command posts, guiding Allied fighters into optimal firing positions. No longer did American pilots have to search the horizon for specks of green camouflaged against the sea. The betas were delivered to them, plotted by radio intercepts and radar sweeps, their courses as clear as ink on a map. When contact came, it was sudden and decisive. The P-38 Lightning, diving from altitude with both engines roaring, struck the formations before their gunners could stabilize. The Betty's long wings, so efficient in cruising flight, became liabilities in combat, presenting broad surfaces that caught rounds like sails catching wind. A single burst from .50 caliber guns tore through fuel lines, igniting the tanks with the same tragic reliability American test pilots had observed. In the Solomons, crews described watching entire formations erupt in seconds, each bomber trailing a ribbon of flame that writhed against the blue sky before plunging into the sea. Even attempts to adapt tactics offered little relief. Japanese commanders ordered low-level torpedo runs, hoping altitude might provide concealment. But Allied ships had grown ruthless in their defenses. Dense curtains of anti-aircraft fire shredded incoming betas long before they reached release range. What few survived the flak met fighters waiting beyond the ship's protective screens, ready to finish what guns from the decks had begun. The ocean floors off the Bismarck Sea filled with twisted metal, torn wings, and the scattered remnants of once elite squadrons. Loss ratios soared to levels no doctrine could justify. There were missions where half the aircraft failed to return, others where entire groups vanished into the haze, leaving only brief flickers of fire on the horizon to mark their passing. Veteran pilots, already shaken by months of attrition, began speaking openly about the bomber's fate. They understood they were flying into battles shaped by technologies Japan had not anticipated and could not match. Each sortie felt less like an offensive operation, and more like a sacrifice demanded by strategy rather than necessity. For the Imperial Navy, the shift was devastating. The Betty had been central to its pre-war vision of long-range diplomacy by force, an aircraft meant to extend influence across oceans, to strike where ships could not reach. But now its range no longer mattered. American fighters, guided by radar and supported by expanding bases, could meet the bomber at almost every stage of its journey. The Pacific had grown small, compressed by the accelerating pace of Allied innovation. As the months passed, the Betty's reputation inverted. Where it had once inspired caution and respect, it now evoked a darker response. Allied pilots described engagements not as fights but as executions, moments where they almost pitied the crews trapped inside machines unable to withstand the realities of a modern air war. Even intelligence officers, detached by necessity, noted the bomber's decline with a tone approaching sorrow. The Betty had been born from ambition and ingenuity. Now it survived only through the determination of crews who understood their aircraft no longer belonged in the skies. By late 1943, Japan struggled to replace losses fast enough to keep squadrons operational. Training programs shortened, maintenance quality declined, and missions were launched with aircraft barely repaired from previous engagements. The Betty was still expected to perform the tasks of a modern frontline bomber, yet every new battle revealed how far the world had moved beyond the philosophy that shaped it. The turning point had arrived, not as a single moment, but as an accumulation of inevitabilities. The Betty, once a symbol of Japan's strategic reach, had become an emblem of its vulnerabilities. The air war had changed, and the bomber that once defined it could no longer survive within it. And in the shadows of this collapse, Japan began turning to more desperate measures, searching for a role the Betty might still play in a war that was slipping beyond its grasp. On the morning of April 18, 1943, the Solomon Islands lay under a soft veil of coastal mist, the kind that blurred distance and softened edges. At an airstrip carved from the jungle, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto approached a waiting pair of Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers. Exhausted from months of fighting yet determined to steady morale, he had agreed to a long inspection tour, a gesture meant to reassure frontline units that the Navy's guiding hand remained steady. The choice of aircraft seemed natural. For years, the Betty had carried Japanese officers across vast stretches of the Pacific with quiet confidence. Yamamoto boarded without ceremony. His schedule, crafted with military precision, laid out each waypoint, each landing, each hour in the air. It was predictability disguised as discipline, exact times, exact route. Exact distances. And it was this predictability, more than any flaw in planning, that placed the admiral within reach of an enemy he could not see. Unknown to the Japanese, American codebreakers at Pearl Harbor had intercepted and decrypted the entire itinerary. Every departure, every leg of the journey, had been lifted from the encrypted message and placed onto an operational map. For the U.S., the opportunity was extraordinary, a chance to strike the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, a man whose strategic mind had shaped the early Pacific War. But seizing that opportunity required an aircraft with exceptional range, the very quality Japan had built into the Betty. The P-38 Lightning, equipped with long-range tanks, became the tool chosen for the mission. Fighters rose from Guadalcanal in the dim hours of morning and headed north over open ocean, stretching their endurance to the limit. It was a mirror image of Japanese doctrine. American pilots now flying deep into enemy territory, guided by intelligence rather than luck, radar rather than intuition. When the Betis appeared on the horizon, moving low and steady above the forest canopy, the outcome unfolded with chilling clarity. The escorting Zero fighters climbed to challenge the interceptors, but the P-38s pressed through with a calm, calculated determination. The Betty carrying Yamamoto held straight to its course, trusting its range to keep it beyond danger. In another era, perhaps it would have worked. In 1943, with American code-breaking and long-range fighters closing in, that trust had become a fatal assumption. The P-38 struck with precision. A burst of .50 caliber fire ripped into the bomber's wing, punching through the thin skin and rupturing fuel lines that had never been designed to resist such impacts. Flames spread instantly, consuming the tank, then the fuselage. The bomber rolled, dipped, and fell in a long, burning arc toward the jungle below. It struck the trees with a dull concussion that echoed across the canopy. Yamamoto, admiral, strategist, reluctant architect of war, died still seated in the aircraft he had believed would carry him safely. Across Japan, the shock was immediate and profound. Crews who had flown the Betty for years felt the loss with a heaviness that carried beyond grief. Yamamoto was not simply a leader. He embodied a philosophy of rational restraint within a military growing increasingly desperate. His death, delivered through the bomber, meant to symbolize Japan's reach, expose the widening cracks in both doctrine and morale. Privately, many airmen acknowledged what they had long suspected. The Betty's lack of armor, once dismissed as a necessary compromise, had now shaped history. A single well-placed burst had penetrated the fuselage with ease. A single plume of flame had ended the life of the nation's most respected naval strategist. The aircraft's vulnerabilities were no longer statistics or engineering disputes. They were strategic consequences written in the loss of a leader whose judgment Japan could not replace. As the news reverberated through naval headquarters, planners understood the symbolic weight of the event. The Betty, once a testament to Japan's ambition, had become a reminder of its limits. The same qualities that allowed it to traverse oceans now made it susceptible to a modern air war that no longer rewarded purity of design. Range, unprotected by armor, could not shield its passengers from a world governed increasingly by intelligence networks, radar grids, and the accelerating pace of American industry. Yamamoto's death marked a turning point not only in the Pacific War, but in Japan's understanding of what the conflict had become. A machine born of vision had been undone by the future it was never built to survive. And yet, even as the shock settled, Japan would continue to send the Betty into the sky, driven now not by confidence, but by the growing shadow of desperation that lay ahead. By late 1944, the air war over the Pacific had entered a phase for which Japan possessed neither the time nor the resources to adapt. Newer aircraft, heavier fighters, sturdier bombers, experimental models rushed from factories, began appearing in limited numbers, yet none arrived in quantities sufficient to replace the Betty. The bomber that had once carried Japan's ambitions across oceans now remained in service not because it was adequate, but because no alternative existed. In a war accelerating beyond Japan's industrial reach, the Betty endured by default. Its missions grew increasingly desperate. As American offensives seized island after island, Japan's outer garrisons found themselves starved of ammunition, medicine, and even food. Supplying them became a grim necessity, and the task fell repeatedly to the Betty. The aircraft's long range made it the only platform capable of reaching remote outposts still clinging to the Empire's perimeter. But each flight demanded passing through skies dominate by Allied fighters and radar systems that traced every approach. Loss rates for these supply missions were catastrophic, planes vanishing into the sea at dusk, or erupting in flame against the outline of distant clouds. Fuel shortages compounded the danger. Japan's shrinking reserves forced commanders to reduce or eliminate fighter escort, sending Betty crews across hostile airspace alone. Pilots who had once flown with confidence now measured each mission in increments of risk. Every additional kilometer of ocean meant a narrower chance of return. The aircraft's long wings, once symbols of reach, now felt like burdens, broad targets that attracted American guns with merciless accuracy. As Japan's situation worsened, the Navy reassigned the Betty to roles far removed from its original purpose. Some units received orders to undertake kamikaze missions, their payloads modified into explosive charges meant to crash into Allied ships. Others were adapted for night infiltration, flying low and slow across black water to drop supplies or small commando teams. These missions demanded precision and calm, but the bomber's fragility remained unchanged. A stray tracer, a flash from a searchlight, even a misjudged descent could bring disaster. The transformation of the Betty into a desperate multi-role platform revealed the extent of Japan's strategic decline. What had begun as a sophisticated long-range bomber, born from pre-war confidence, now served as a stopgap tool. Whatever task arose, however dangerous, however unlikely to succeed. Its once clean silhouette, so familiar to Allied pilots, became a symbol of improvisation under pressure. Every new mission type highlighted the same flaws American observers had seen on that silent captured airstrip. Thin armor, exposed lines, unprotected tanks. No reassignment could erase the design choices etched into its frame. Within Japan's air service, morale suffered in ways that echoed earlier stages of the war, but with deeper resignation. Crews understood that the Betty was no longer matched to the world it flew through. Experienced aviators were killed faster than they could be replaced, and new trainees found themselves stepping into a machine whose reputation preceded it. Some accepted the risk as duty. Others confided quietly that each takeoff felt like an act of defiance against mathematics. American pilots, now thoroughly familiar with the bomber's vulnerabilities, encountered the Betty with mixed emotions. They admired its grace and respected its early war achievements, but by 1944 they also recognized it as an aircraft out of time, one whose continued presence in combat reflected Japan's diminishing options, not its strength. When they saw a Betty burning against the horizon, it no longer represented a tactical victory alone. It represented a doctrine collapsing in slow motion. By the final months of 1944, the Betty's losses had become emblematic of something larger, the unraveling of Japan's pre-war aviation philosophy. The belief that range could outweigh protection, that speed and distance were enough to secure survival, had been disproven in battle after battle. The bomber that once embodied Japan's strategic ambition now illustrated the fatal consequences of inflexible doctrine meeting evolving warfare. And yet, even as the Betty's usefulness dwindled, Japan continued to send it into the air, pushed by necessity, constrained by shortage, moved by the hope that a familiar machine might still influence a war that had already passed it by. Ahead lay the final stage of its transformation, when desperation would push the Betty into roles darker and more irreversible than any its designers could have imagined. By 1944, surviving Japanese aviators spoke of flying the Betty with a tone that blended professionalism with fatalism. They had grown up in an air force that prized discipline, silence, and endurance, yet the realities of combat forced them into a private reckoning. Every mission began with the knowledge that their bomber, sleek, familiar, meant to symbolize reach, might become a burning shell within seconds of meeting the enemy. The long walk from briefing tent to aircraft became, for many, an act of quiet resolve. Crews understood the mathematics of their survival. They had seen Betties ignite from a single enemy round, traced the scars left by shrapnel along the fuselages of the few that limped home, and heard the stories of pilots whose parachutes never opened because flames reached them first. Inside the cockpit, the thin metal walls felt less like armor than like the surface of a lantern, something meant to hold shape, not resist impact. Even the rhythmic vibration of the engines reminded them that the aircraft's strength lay in motion, not protection. Letters preserved from that era reveal a striking honesty. Pilots wrote to families with firm, steady handwriting, acknowledging the danger without dramatizing it. They described the Betty as a beautiful machine, but one that burns too easily, or a bird designed to fly fast, not to survive. These were not complaints. They were statements of understanding, reflections from men who accepted the flaws of the machine because they had no choice but to fly it. Their resignation was quiet, measured, and deeply human. Commanders, too, recognized the risks embedded in every takeoff. Reports reaching Tokyo outlined the vulnerabilities with technical precision. The unprotected tanks, the fragile wing structure, the persistent ignition pattern. But necessity outweighed caution. Japan lacked the aircraft to replace the Betty, lacked the fuel to maintain escorts, and lacked the industrial capacity to redesign its bomber fleet. Doctrine, once rooted in confidence, had hardened into inflexibility. And so commanders continued to deploy Betty units even as survival odds shrank, each decision shaped by a mixture of obligation and inevitability. The aircraft's rigidity, its design locked into a pre-war philosophy, became a metaphor for the institution itself. Just as engineers struggled to reinforce a frame never meant for armor, strategists struggled to adapt a worldview that no longer aligned with the realities of 1944. In both steel and structure, the limits were the same. Too little protection, too little flexibility, too little time. Across the front lines, American pilots developed an unexpected respect for the aviators who flew the Betty. They understood the courage required to board a machine whose weaknesses were so well known. Many described engagements with a note of gravity, recognizing that the men inside were not reckless, but committed. In debriefings, some spoke of seeing Betty crews hold formation even as flames crawled along a wing. Others recalled gunners firing until the last moment, trying to shield their comrades despite the inevitable. The technology might have failed them, but their resolve did not. This respect did not soften the combat, but it shaped the memory of it. After the war, American pilots often reflected on the paradox they had witnessed. A bomber so technically fragile flown by crews of unwavering discipline. They remembered the smell of burning fuel drifting across the sea, the falling arcs of light traced by dying aircraft, and the knowledge that inside each wreck was a story cut short by design limitations no aviator could outrun. By the end of the conflict, the Betty had come to symbolize more than a machine. It represented the human cost of decisions made years before the war reached its most brutal phase. It embodied the tension between ambition and reality, between doctrine and adaptation, between the limits of steel and the endurance of the people who relied upon it. And as Japan faced the final, desperate months of the war, another transformation awaited the Betty, one that would push its crews into roles where survival was no longer expected, but simply hoped for. In the years after the war, the Mitsubishi G4M Betty became the subject of quiet, deliberate study. Engineers and historians gathered around surviving airframes, some scorched, some patched, some remarkably intact, looking not simply for technical flaws, but for the deeper assumptions that had shaped the bomber from its inception. They understood that machines do not emerge from factories as isolated objects. They reflect the hopes, fears, and strategies of the nations that build them. And in the Betty's clean lines and fragile skin, analysts found a philosophy laid bare. Post-war evaluations began by examining the strategic rationale behind the aircraft. Japan had prioritized offensive reach above all else. Everything about the Betty, its wingspan, its fuel load, its absence of armor, revealed a singular belief that distance itself could be a form of protection. To Japanese planners in the late 1930s, this logic felt sound. A bomber capable of striking distant targets without relying on vulnerable forward bases promised an advantage in a Pacific defined by vastness. Range, they argued, would shield crews more effectively than steel. But as analysts traced the contours of the airframe with calipers and diagrams, the consequences of this reasoning became unmistakable. The Betty offered no redundancy around its fuel tanks, no meaningful reinforcement to withstand enemy fire, and no margin for systemic failure. U.S. engineers highlighted one detail above all: the absence of self-sealing tanks. It was a decision driven not by ignorance, but by weight limitations and resource shortages. Yet it transformed the bomber from a strategic asset into a liability the moment the skies grew hostile. These studies became more than technical reports. They evolved into case studies on the intersection of doctrine and design. Where Japan had accepted fragility in exchange for reach, Allied aircraft adopted a broader philosophy, balancing endurance with armor, payload with protection, speed with survivability. Post-war design committees used the Betty as a S. Stark illustration of what happens when one principle overwhelms all others. A machine optimized too narrowly, they concluded, may excel briefly before collapsing under the weight of its own specialization. Modern bombers began incorporating lessons drawn from the Betty's failures. Engineers learned to integrate self-sealing systems as standard rather than optional. Fuel tanks were placed deeper within protected structures. Armor distribution was reconsidered, not merely in terms of mass, but in terms of expected threats and operational realities. Even long-range platforms, the spiritual successors to the Betty, embraced adaptability, knowing that conflict could evolve faster than doctrine. Yet beyond engineering, the Betty offered a broader reflection on war itself. Its story demonstrated how a strategic assumption, if left unchallenged, can persist long after the world around it has changed. Japan's belief in the primacy of range had been rational at first, perhaps even visionary. But when the war shifted, the doctrine remained fixed, and the aircraft built to embody it became trapped between past logic and present danger. Analysts saw in the Betty a cautionary tale about the perils of inflexibility, whether in machines, institutions, or nations. In museums and research archives, the captured airframe stood almost silently, its surfaces weathered by time but still telling the same story. The thin metal that once vibrated through Pacific skies now reflected overhead lights in climate-controlled rooms. The exposed wiring that once carried life through the fuselage now lay open for inspection. Every detail reminded visitors that technology does not simply function, it communicates. It reveals the priorities of its creators, the pressures of its era, and the consequences of choices made in moments when certainty seemed justified. Ultimately, the Betty's legacy extended far beyond its operational history. It became a quiet witness to the evolution of air warfare, a relic that allowed future generations to measure how the balance between offense and defense, ambition and practicality, can shape the fate of both machines and the people who fly them. And as analysts finished their reports, one question lingered, a question that moved the story from past to present. What happens when the next war challenges today's assumptions, just as the Pacific War challenged those that shaped the Betty? The captured Betty, resting in the stillness of a foreign airfield, became more than an aircraft preserved for technical study. It stood as a symbol of a nation's ambition stretching beyond its own pragmatism, a relic forged from a belief that range alone could shape the Pacific. Its wings, long and elegant, seemed to promise a future defined by reach. Yet the thin metal beneath those curves told a different story, one where vision strayed too far from the realities of war. For designers at Mitsubishi, the aircraft had been an engineering triumph, a machine capable of crossing distances that once limited Japan's strategic imagination. But as analysts examined the airframe after the war, the contradictions embedded within its structure became impossible to ignore. Beneath the smooth skin lay compromises that had accumulated like hidden debts, absent armor, exposed lines, and fuel tanks that provided endurance at the cost of survival. These choices were deliberate, calculated, and at first successful, but they carried within them the seeds of future tragedy. American pilots who fought in the Solomons, New Guinea, and the Bismarck Sea never forgot the sight of the Betty under fire. They spoke of how easily it ignited, how one well-placed burst caused the aircraft to bloom into flame as if it were made of tinder. The bomber's silhouette, once feared for its range and payload, soon became associated with the fiery arcs that marked its downfall. Some pilots described pulling away from engagements with a quiet unease, aware that the men inside had little chance of escape once the tanks were struck. The respect they felt for the crews coexisted with the knowledge that the aircraft itself offered them almost no protection. Japanese veterans carried a different memory. For them, the Betty was not simply a machine. It was the vessel that carried friends, mentors, and entire crews into battle. They recalled the heat of the engines before takeoff, the vibration through the fuselage, and the tension that settled in the cockpit each time enemy fighters approached. Many had witnessed bombers vanish in sudden flashes of light, their descent leaving only falling embers to mark where comrades had been moments before. The fragility of the aircraft became a constant companion, a reality acknowledged in letters home and whispered conversations before missions. It shaped their understanding of duty, sacrifice, and survival. Over time, historians came to see the Betty as a monument to the consequences of rigid doctrine. Japan had built the bomber for a specific kind of war, one in which surprise, speed, and distance would prevail. But when the conflict evolved, when radar networks spread and Allied fighters grew faster and more numerous, the aircraft could not evolve with it. The frame that once embodied innovation now represented the limits of a strategy unwilling to adapt. The Betty's failures were not simply mechanical. They were philosophical, rooted in assumptions that no longer aligned with the world unfolding in the skies. In the end, the unprotected fuel tanks told the whole story. They were the heart of the bomber's range, the reason it achieved early victories, and the reason it suffered catastrophic losses. They symbolized the duality within the aircraft, extraordinary reach paired with extraordinary risk. Every engineer who studied the captured airframe saw the same truth. The Betty was not a mistake. It was the logical result of a doctrine that prioritized ambition over resilience. They had built it to fly farther, farther than any bomber of its era, across seas that once defined the limits of Japanese power. What they never expected was how quickly it would burn. And as the sun set on the airfields where the last Betis stood silent, the aircraft remained a testament to the enduring lesson at the intersection of war and engineering. That reach without protection is not strength, and that vision without adaptation is its own undoing.